This episode is brought to you by Nespresso and Samra Origins by the Weekend Coffee Collection.
Introducing Samra Origins. My collaboration with Nespresso is a connection to my roots, to my mother, Samra. Coffee that hits the right notes. It transports you. Crafted with unique notes and bold soaring flavors. Experience a taste that moves you. Nespresso and Samra Origins.
Discover more at Nespresso.com.
Hello and welcome to Hot Take. I'm Mary Anais Hegler.
And I'm Amy Westervelt. Mary, today we're going to talk about something that tends to really freak people out, but, maybe it shouldn't. Should the U.S. nationalize its oil companies? Big question.
Yeah, I'm going to be real honest. I don't even know what that means. But we have the perfect person joining us to talk about it, Kate Aronoff, the climate reporter for The New Republic.
That's right. Kate has been talking about nationalization for a while now, and I think she tackles it better than anyone we know. Before we get to that conversation, though, a little background for why we're talking about this now in particular. In a word, Russia.
Okay, so here's what I do know, or think I know. So Russia had barely even gotten started in Ukraine before the fossil fuel companies were clamoring for even less regulations so they could drill more. Mm-hmm. And they blamed the spike in gas prices on all sorts of things. Biden's ban on Russian oil, the existence of some mythical climate policy that was keeping them from drilling more, the cancellation of the Keystone XL pipeline. But none of that is actually true, is it?
That's right. None of it's true.
Knew it. Knew it.
Yeah. First of all, gas prices don't necessarily map to actual supply and demand. They're more of a reflection of what's going on in energy markets. Sometimes, eventually they might map to supply and demand, but they are not right now. They're also partially set by the oil companies themselves. So oil companies set wholesale prices for the gas stations. Obviously the retail prices are based on the wholesale prices, and those are set by the oil companies.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. It's like in the same way that, dairies set the wholesale price for milk, and that, plays into the price at the grocery store. Oil companies set the wholesale prices for oil. The oil companies are also pretty much in control of production. So this whole idea that someone is telling them how much to produce is complete bullshit. They're the ones who decide what to produce. They could maybe be constrained by a lack of pipelines or export terminals, but there really haven't been any restrictions put on those by the Biden administration. And in fact, earlier this month, FERC, which is this wonky federal agency that's in charge of approving pipelines, they decided not to implement a policy that would require them to consider the climate impact of new pipelines when they're permitting them.
So they can just put a pipeline down with full climate impunity.
Yeah, it's crazy.
Not thinking about the future at all.
Yes, the whole way, there are actually guidelines, and FERC could and should implement them when it comes to looking at the climate impacts of pipelines. But under the Trump administration, they decided to limit how they look at that to just the emissions that are associated with building the pipeline, not with how it's actually going to be used, which is ridiculous. Ridiculous. Yeah.
This is why it drives me crazy when they say that government inaction is the cause of climate change, because there's a lot of fucking action.
Yeah, exactly. And then this whole story about how the Keystone XL pipeline would have saved us all from high gas prices or, been able to help with this whole Russia situation is totally bullshit. First of all, Keystone was primarily earmarked for exporting oil and gas, not for domestic supply. So, it wouldn't have really necessarily mattered to domestic supply. And even if it hadn't been canceled when it wouldn't have been anywhere near completed by now. It wouldn't have been completed until the end of 2023 at the earliest. So the idea that it would have been helping right now, not true. And on top of the fact that less than 10% of it was built when that permit was canceled, they still hadn't figured out how they were going to pay for finishing it. They had like 80% of their budget left to finish that project. So this idea that like there was this amazing pipeline that was almost done that would have totally helped us, none of it's true.
Why am I not surprised?
Yeah.
Which brings us to the role of the United States as a global exporter of oil and gas. I see them talking about this all the time on Twitter, this energy independence stuff, and we need to drill for more national security and energy independence. But if we're so energy independent, why is all this Russia stuff even our problem?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So a lot of what we're seeing right now is pretty reminiscent of what the country went through back in the 70s. So the U.S. supported Israel in the Arab-Israeli War. And in response to that, the Arab members of OPEC, which is the Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries, they put a ban on exporting oil to the U.S. So at that time, actually, the supply crunch was real. There really was like not enough oil and prices shot up and people had to line up for gas. People were assigned particular days of the week that they were allowed to go to gas stations. It was crazy. So in 1975, the government instituted an export ban. They said, we don't want this to happen again. We need to keep our supply of oil here. The end. And that was in place for more than 30 years. It was actually only lifted in 2015 under Obama, and that was mostly driven by the fracking boom and a lot of lobbying from the oil and gas guys to get President Obama to lift that ban.
I remember 2015.
Yeah, it feels like 100 years ago. Yeah.
It does. It does. Yeah, I want to take a quick moment to point out that at the time, the government and the oil companies knew about climate change. Yep. And now here we are again, beholden to global markets. I feel like we'd be more energy independent if we weren't depending on a finite resource buried deep in the earth, but what do I know?
Yeah. Why do you hate freedom gas so much, Mary?
For a lot of fucking reasons. Number one is just methane. It's just methane with a cute little name. It's actually not that cute. It's kind of a shitty name.
Yeah. So yeah, all of the stuff that the industry was talking about to get the export ban lifted was total bullshit. But unfortunately, like right now, I don't think that the conversation about reinstating an export ban is even like a remote possibility because people are like, but what will Europe do? We need to help them with our gas. The nationalization conversation, though, has kind of come back into the public consciousness. And one thing that I've been thinking about, especially with this agreement that Biden made with the EU about building out more infrastructure so that America can supply Europe with more gas, is what it would look like if the government was actually in charge of that instead of oil companies. Because, the oil companies are really driving this idea that, if we're going to do this and build out all this infrastructure, then we want there to be guaranteed demand until 2030. Which means that, whatever increased gas production they start now, they're going to keep going at that level until at least 2030. And of course, we just heard from the IPCC that not only can there be zero new fossil fuel development, but we need to start decommissioning the fossil fuel infrastructure that exists. And we know from history that the fossil fuel industry doesn't just shut things down when demand drops. So, we're looking at locking in this shit for a long time.
Yeah. And I think the IPCC said that we need to peak emissions by 2025.
Yep.
Which is 3 years from now?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So kind of not a good time to start drilling new shit out of the ground.
Yeah, exactly. But then it's not like I have a lot of faith in the government making better decisions than the oil companies right now either. I mean,
they're kind of the same thing.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. And, the Democrats hauled oil executives into Congress for this hearing on price gouging about gas prices. This thing that we talked about a minute ago where they're raking in profits and not really doing anything to reduce the price of gas at the pump. And that whole thing ended with the Democrats demanding that all the oil companies agree to increase production. I was like, no.
Oh, God. Well, that's just perfect. I also have questions about how the U.S. is going to nationalize its oil, but without becoming like Saudi Arabia or Russia, for that matter, which don't exactly have the greatest track record when it comes to climate or human rights.
Yeah, totally. So we desperately need to talk to Kate Aronoff. She's here. That conversation is coming up right after this quick break.
My cat Freddie loves to be brushed and cuddled. But stirring up his cat allergens meant sneezing and itchy eyes. Then I found Purina One Live Clear. It's cat food that reduced the major allergen and my suffering in as little as 21 days. Now, we feel closer than ever. If you have issues with cat allergens, you really need to try Purina One Live Clear.
Try new Purina One Live Clear today. Purina One, a difference from day one.
Hey, it's Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile. Now, I was looking for fun ways to tell you that Mint's offer of unlimited premium wireless for $15 a month is back. So I thought it would be fun if we made $15 bills. But it turns out that's very illegal. So there goes my big idea for the commercial. Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
Upfront payment of $45 for 3-month plan, equivalent to $15 per month required. New customer offer for first 3 months only. Speed slow after 35 gigabytes if network's busy. Taxes and fees extra. See mintmobile.com.
On to nationalization. Kate, can you define for us real quick what exactly it means to nationalize an oil industry and what it means for the U.S.?
Yeah, so I like to think of nationalization as a sort of management technology, right? So there's nothing inherent to nationalization which imbues it with any sort of specific political qualities or characteristics, but it can exist sort of along a spectrum, right? And so historically, when the United States has nationalized things, as we do frequently in wartime, for instance, the government will take ownership maybe of a certain part of the production process, right? Like a factory, or it will take up a public stake, right? And when we talk about nationalizing the fossil fuel industry, for instance, it basically means, as I have written about and in different places, and other people, such as at the Democracy Collaborative, have written about, essentially taking a public stake in this industry, which is very, very important to the sort of functioning of our country and the functioning of the sort of global capitalist system, and essentially giving the public a say in this sector that we already pour an enormous amount of money into, right? So every year, conservatively speaking, the United States government gives about $36 billion to oil and gas companies, give or take, and that changes year to year. It changes based on the definition of what you mean by a subsidy. But what nationalization can do is to allow the government essentially to act like any other shareholder in these companies, right? So companies have shareholders, those shareholders get a say in how those companies are run. And so if, as in the case of Ørsted, the Danish former oil and gas company turned wind company, or Equinor, Norway's state-owned oil and gas company, the government, has a very large ownership stake in those companies and gets a say over what they do, right? And so Ørsted, there's 50.1% stake, which is sort of the low end for what is technically considered government ownership. And Equinor, there's a 67% stake, so that's a bit more considerable, right? And so what that means is that the government can do something that it doesn't do currently, which is to have a sort of say over how is oil being produced? How are we making investment decisions in this resource, which again is very, very important to how this country operates and obviously important to the future of the planet and whether or not we make good on these climate commitments that we've set out. How that happens can look, a number of different ways. But one thing, I would just say is that we have actually quite a lot of quote unquote nationalized things in the United States, right? So the Postal Service is a nationalized sector, right? That is government owned. The Tennessee Valley Authority is a big example of sort of public power, right? Set up during the New Deal. About 49 million Americans get their power through some kind of publicly owned or cooperatively owned electric utility. So this is very common sort of in the scope of U.S. history. And we have a lot of nationalized institutions. And we've also nationalized institutions at various points in our history to deal with various crises, most sort of recognizably during World War II, right? When about a quarter of manufacturing in the United States was nationalized at one point or another to meet national security demands. And, maybe the last thing I'll say before we dive in a little bit deeper is just that this is sort of normal for how especially major oil producing countries sort of run this part of their economy, which in some cases like ours is a pretty big chunk of it, because these resources, belong ostensibly to everyone, right? They are sort of under our feet, and the public should get some say over how they're governed and get some benefit, right, from how these profits are divided. So right now, what the United States government does is hand those profits off essentially to already very rich people without, providing much of a benefit to the vast majority of us who are forced to live with the climate crisis, who are forced to live in some cases next door to these hugely polluting facilities. And that is just not the case for very logical reasons. And the United States has a very strange energy sector in that sense, and that it is entirely dominated by private industry, right? And we can make little tweaks around the edges. We have a little more control over what happens on public lands versus private lands. But in general, there's a sort of nudging approach that is just very strange in the broad span of how oil production happens all over the world.
Okay, so you said that the postal industry is nationalized, but did I think about private competitors like FedEx and UPS? So if we nationalize the oil companies, does that still bar other independent oil companies from popping up?
Yeah, that's a good question. And there's a lot of people, and I won't say there are a lot of folks who are sort of actively thinking through what the nationalization of the U.S. fossil fuel sector could look like. But those that do, point to the fact that this can happen in a number of different ways, right? And so in the early part of the pandemic in 2020, when oil prices briefly went negative, when a lot of these companies were sort of asking the federal government for support, there was this question of, well, should we, provide a bailout? Should the United States government bail these companies out, which we ended up doing to a certain extent? That process, if it had gone a different way, could have looked a bit more like what happened to the auto industry, for instance, after 2008, when the government took a 74% stake in GM and just ceded all of its rights. And so that, was in effect a form of nationalization, right? And it didn't, drastically change the character of the auto sector. I mean, in part because Obama said, we don't want to run this company. We don't want to be in the business of running companies as a U.S. government. But that was a form of nationalization to save the industry, to make some very minor changes in leadership. But that, is along the low end of the spectrum of what we're happening. And so you could imagine, right, and it's theoretically possible that the U.S. government could buy up stakes in every single oil and gas producer, coal producer in the country, especially right now. Obviously, that would be very expensive, and just totally take over the sector. But generally, when people talk about nationalization, it's a bit more piecemeal, and you could imagine something like, a kind of public holding company that would be a sort of repository for nationalized assets. So say, you take $100 billion, you buy up majority stakes in some smaller companies, and then you have this sort of institution which is charged with governing them, for instance, right? And this is all, a bit speculative. Obviously, we're struggling to pass much less ambitious climate policy right now, but that kind of system, right, wouldn't preclude other private drillers from existing. But what nationalization can often do, and what public ownership can often do, across a number of different settings is to sort of provide a stick, right? And to say, look, we have certain national priorities. We want to meet our climate goals. And if you don't abide by that, then we have this tool that we can use and we can bring you under public ownership. And that historically, you know, especially in the case of World War II, is how nationalization has proceeded, right? It's not that the government went in and said, we're going to all at once nationalize manufacturing. It was, we have a set of priorities we want to meet, and there are a lot of carrots that we're using to get you to do that. And here's a stick, right? If you don't, you know, accept these government contracts, which are fairly lucrative, which, you know, are going to be good for you in the long term, then we have a harsher option that we can exercise. And
so we're putting oil companies in a conservatorship. So it's like free Britney and lock up BP.
Oh, no.
I'll start that hashtag. I'll start it.
I'm weary to make that comparison. Because I like Britney Spears a lot more than I like any oil and gas producing company.
Oh, yeah, same. That's what I'm saying. Like, get her out of the conservatorship, get them in a conservatorship, right? Like, they don't know what's good for them or anyone else. So, makes sense to me.
That's not totally wrong. Yes.
Let me have this.
That's so interesting, too, because I was talking to someone recently, Ben Fronta, who's like a researcher at Stanford, was talking about, you know, like how could we deal with oil companies' tendency to lie and mislead the public without stepping afoul of the First Amendment. And something he suggested was what he called information receivership, which is like, well, if an industry has, you know, kind of operated in bad faith with the public over and over and over again, then you should be able to like appoint some sort of, you know, person who like oversees their messages to the public and ensures that they're not misleading. And I was like, oh, that's actually kind of an interesting way to think about it. And I don't know, this seems like adjacent to that in a way of like where, you know, they've made poor decisions over and over again and, you know, are just kind of focused on profits and short-term gain and all of that, those things that are just not conducive to making decisions that benefit the public good.
Totally. Yeah. And one thing that people were talking about more in sort of spring 2020, when a lot of these companies were doing quite badly, was what it looks like to attach strings to either new money that was going out to these companies, you know, the many billions of dollars of subsidies they get every year, but also, you know, if the government is buying up corporate bonds, which it did in the pandemic, then what kind of strings can you attach? And that, you know, is one sort of avenue, maybe if not for full public ownership or, you know, a 50.1% stake, then at least for that sort of thing that Ben was talking about, to give a little bit more say to the state to, you know, have a bit of direction over how these companies operate.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Right. I guess my question for both of you, because I know, Amy, you've written a lot about this too, is so we subsidize the oil companies quite a lot, like you were just saying. So where do subsidies and regulations end and nationalization begins? So it feels like we're like halfway to nationalization already. We just don't get any of the benefits.
Yeah. So we do provide just an enormous amount of money to these companies to basically do whatever they want with, right? And so that creates the sort of situation we've seen in the last couple of weeks, and which, Amy, you've written about, that the government is just sort of begging companies to drill more, right? They're just saying, you know, please, please, will you produce more oil that you can sell for $200 a barrel potentially? But that's sort of, you know, what they're doing right now. But people, especially in the United States, tend to think about something like nationalization as this huge government overreach, right? As this really sort of dramatic intervention of the state. But it's not as if the US government isn't already intervening in the sector in a number of other ways, right? It's not as if the state doesn't actively shape how energy production happens, and it always has. And so the way I think about nationalization is that it's redirecting that support toward meeting climate priorities, toward meeting national priorities, and just having that be honestly a bit more effective than it is now, which is this really strange sort of prodding mechanism that we, just provide signals for them to do kind of the right thing or whatever, the administration of the time thinks is the right thing.
Yeah, I don't really have anything different to say. I think that, I don't know, it seems crazy to me that after the billions of dollars in subsidies plus all of the many ways that the government kind of bends over backwards to help the fossil fuel industry, that it has to resort to like publicly begging them to drill for more oil seems really ridiculous. Yeah, I think nationalization gets talked about as like a total government takeover, but the way that it's happened in this country and the way that people are talking about it now, it would really just kind of like fix this problem that you talked about, Mary, where like, we're giving them all of the, like right now, I think oil companies sort of have all of the good parts of nationalization, but with none of the reins on their behavior.
So when I first started hearing about nationalization, I think the first time I heard about it as it relates to the oil industry was like 2016 with the Bernie Sanders campaign. Mm-hmm. And what I didn't quite understand is why would we want to nationalize something that we want to get rid of? So what are the climate benefits of nationalization?
That is an excellent question. Yeah, so people who are listening may well be familiar with other state-owned oil companies, which are not exactly great actors on climate change.
What do you mean? Saudi Aramco is amazing. I'm just kidding.
That climate hero we all love, Saudi Aramco. And that is a very real history and present reality. And on climate, the sort of existing status of either publicly or privately owned oil companies does not give us much reason for hope. But how I think about this question, is to just look at what has happened to the assets of major oil companies who are already, making commitments to go net zero, however they happen to define that. And there is no standard definition for what net zero means, as we well know. But companies like BP, right, who cast themselves as these leaders, and what that looks like on their own balance sheets when they say we're going to, scale down oil production by a certain amount, is that they will sell off their most toxic assets, often some of their most unprofitable assets, right? In places like Alaska, where drilling is very expensive to do. Really, they're not getting as much out of that as they are in other places. And who do they sell that to, right? There are much less scrutinized companies or even private equity firms in some cases who come in and snap them up and then just pump up drilling as much as they want out of sort of any public transparency, out of a lot of regulatory transparency that tends to accompany these bigger oil companies. And so nationalization sort of provides a way to keep that from happening, right? Both from a sort of climate standpoint, right? And saying you can't just sell these assets off at a profit or a loss or whatever, and allow some other company to just drill more while you make yourselves look green and climate friendly and all this stuff. And for the people who work at these companies, right? So, you can't just go and lay off people who in some cases live in places that have whole political economies structured around extractive industry. And nationalization provides a way both to, actually make sure that those sites are shut down and not just pumped for more oil or coal or gas or whatever, but also to make sure that, people get what could reasonably call it a just transition. Either, allowed to retire early, sort of looking out for people who are in those sectors, or in the cases where people really can sort of retrain and enter new industries, like something like geothermal, where there's a lot of crossover and sort of skill set people have in the oil and gas industry. That can be a vehicle, a nationalized oil company can be a vehicle for people to enter the clean energy economy, right? In a way that is not going to be presented if you just are a multinational oil company who wants to get rid of your worst assets and fire the people who are involved with them, right? And so it is this much more sort of managed decline if that happens sort of in the confines of, the government actually saying we need to shut down this production, not just get it off of our balance sheets because it looks bad or it's, not profitable for us.
Yeah. I feel like in like extremely simple terms, we're talking about like a managed transition here, which is not going to happen if the oil companies are just left up to their own devices.
Exactly.
Which brings me back to my conservatorship. I think it still works.
We just send the oil companies on a couple of residencies in Las Vegas and
make them work for us. I'm just kidding.
Oh, God. Britney, you didn't deserve that. You deserve so much better.
Yeah.
This episode is brought to you by Indeed. When your computer breaks, you don't wait for it to magically start working again. You fix the problem. So why wait to hire the people your company desperately needs? Use Indeed's sponsored jobs to hire top talent fast. And even better, you only pay for results. There's no need to wait. Speed up your hiring with a $75 sponsored job credit at Indeed.com/podcast. Terms and conditions apply.
You know that feeling when someone shows up for you just when you need it most? That's what Uber is all about. Not just a ride or dinner at your door. It's how Uber helps you show up for the moments that matter. Because showing up can turn a tough day around or make a good one even better. Whatever it is, big or small, Uber is on the way. So you can be on yours. Uber, on our way.
Okay, so how does all of this intersect with the Russia-Ukraine situation?
Yeah, so right now, as people might have seen, and, just in the sort of immediate aftermath of Russia invading Ukraine, there's this threat that one of two things will happen. So either the European Union, which is hugely dependent on Russia for oil and especially gas, will start to sanction those products, which would be very difficult, but is being actively talked about, or that Russia itself will cut off those taps as quickly as they can. That doesn't happen necessarily overnight, but there are mechanisms by which they could be supplying much less oil and gas to Europe. And so in response to that, U.S. fossil fuel companies in particular have been saying that the U.S. can step in to fill that gap, right? We're on track to be the largest exporter of liquefied natural gas in the world. And so the sort of pitch from fossil fuel companies right now has been that, American energy can step up if we unleash America's energy potential, that all of that can come to the aid of the brave Ukrainian people. And we will, create world peace by pumping more fossil fuels. That's the basic pitch. But that is the public messaging. What the companies are actually saying, especially shale drillers, for instance, is that they don't want to drill more, right? That they spent the last 10 years burning through investor money. The sector, number of companies in shale drilling went bankrupt, have gone bankrupt since the Great Recession when the boom really took off. And now the ones that are left are a bit bigger and are on sort of a tight leash from their investors who are saying, we want you to grow much more slowly than you were in sort of 2010, 2011, 2012, even, more recently than that, and to return really generous dividends and share buybacks to shareholders. So to make it worth our while to invest in you, you need to give us a lot of money. And that means not, chasing $150 per barrel oil, not chasing $200 per barrel oil, sticking to a sort of steady path where you can prove profitability for decades to come. And so the Biden administration is now wanting to ramp up oil production, wanting to, get wells producing quickly, which is a very difficult thing to do in the short term after, a period of less investment in new rigs and things. And so is basically begging the oil and gas industry to produce more, and is walking this very awkward line right now of trying to be nice to the industry, because that's sort of one of the only things they can do at this moment, or one of the only things they're willing to do at this moment is to say nice things about them, and then on the other hand, sort of yelling at them for delivering very generous returns to their shareholders. So doing sort of two things at once that is pissing off almost everyone involved. And that is because we have a private sector dominated oil and gas industry and fossil fuel industry, and that they just, do not have a willingness to pick up the sort of broader range of tools which other governments use, which the US government has used historically, to exercise more control over how production happens and how to wind that down. And so the danger in this moment is that as the administration really wants companies to drill more, even, and we can talk about this in a way that is not needed, right? There's a really good argument to be made that we don't actually need this huge boom in new drilling, especially a boom in new infrastructure, in order to, meet demands in the short term, but that they are just the government is trying to provide all these signals to stabilize the price of oil, maybe to pay them to drill more with things like loan guarantees, or to fine them, as Biden has suggested, for not drilling more. So they are using all these sort of nudging tools, but in reality, the conversations about how investment in fossil fuel production happens are conversations between executives at these companies and their investors, right? And so the decision of whether an LNG terminal that comes online now stays online for 30 years to come, well after we need to be actively shutting down production, whether, any sort of new drilling infrastructure can stay online for 50 or 60 years, potentially. That is not a conversation the government is involved in right now. And so all that the administration has done so far is to provide signals for more production to happen, which, as the industry talks about it, means building new infrastructure that will be with us for many, many decades, beyond which we should have transitioned away from fossil fuels. And without a real claim to those investment decisions, those planning decisions, that sets us up for something very dangerous. We were already off track, and we're already planning to produce much, much more oil and gas than was compatible with keeping warming certainly below 1.5 degrees, but 2 degrees, right? And so right now, because this is, a conversation dominated by the private sector, the real danger is that the sort of indirect ways the government is encouraging companies to produce will lock us into even more dangerous levels of fossil fuel exploration and production and infrastructure than we were already on track for. And nationalization, just to round this out, could provide a way to meet, sort of short-term demands, and also make sure we're not locking in this dangerous infrastructure for many, many decades to come.
Yeah, that kind of makes me think of, the net zero targets. And I was just wondering, do you know what the 0 said to the 8, Kate?
Wow, just really dramatic frame shift.
It's an amazing segue.
What did the 0 say to the 8?
It said nice belt.
Great. I like that.
So good. So good. Okay, so I think that whole conversation, I think that like the only way that the situation that we're seeing now, which is like this ramp up of infrastructure that's just going to be in place for decades, would be less bad as if there were a nationalized industry and someone saying, okay, we're going to do this for, however long we need to deal with this short-term problem, and then we're immediately going to transition away from it. But I also think it's a good segue into this thing that we talked about a moment ago, where, we do have a lot of examples around the world of nationalized oil industries that are not good actors on climate. So what are some examples of countries that have nationalized oil and are behaving the way that we would want to see the US behave? I don't know if Norway is a good example or not. I don't know if there's other ones that you can think of that that would be kind of models for this, or would it be the case where it would have to be a totally different approach than what we've seen elsewhere?
Yeah, I don't know if there is a great example out there. And I've spent a little time talking to folks in Norway, and they are massively frustrated with the way that Equinor operates. I mean, of course, Equinor is, I think probably a bit more forward thinking than Exxon, for instance. But
not hard. Yeah.
Right. It's a complicated situation because obviously Equinor's profits go into this massive sovereign wealth fund, which, provides a lot of things we would like, right? Like healthcare and a sort of generous social safety net. But the company itself, which, like I said, is two thirds owned by the Norwegian government, operates very much like a private company. And that is in part because the sort of national mandate, right, is to feed the sovereign wealth fund that then funds the state and through investments in other places. So, I don't think there's a great public or private sector example of an oil company which is really doing the right thing. The one place, which I'm not an expert on at all, would be Ørsted, which is the former oil and gas company of Denmark, which has transitioned almost entirely into wind, right? And so they're now a major wind developer in the United States. And that was a very difficult process that involved a lot of state intervention, involved sort of years of planning about how that would happen. And that's in a country which, never produced a sort of tremendous amount of oil and gas. But that is the sort of one kind of interesting case in which a national oil company did actually transition meaningfully into something else. And, the thing that I tend to emphasize around these questions that, again, there's nothing sort of special about nationalization, right? This is just sort of a mechanism, kind of form of ownership, a form of management that can be used and presents a few more options than private ownership, right? A few more sort of direct paths for the government to operate. And in doing so, that means that we aren't sort of begging a set of companies that have spent decades lying to the public to do the right thing.
That's kind of a bad bet.
A foolproof strategy. Yeah.
Yeah. It's a technology, right? And so that is subject, right, to things like democracy, which means that depending on how you set a national oil company up, it could be under the control of Donald Trump, in 2024, which is a very scary thing to consider. And so what do you build into the sort of charter of a new company that gives it a mandate to wind down production along climate terms? And the last thing I'll say on this is that I think it's hard to imagine a situation in which the United States government moves to nationalize oil and gas companies in 2022 or 2023 or 2024, in which that is not a very radical act, in which that is not something which has a very certain political valence and is loaded with a certain political character that, is not to do the same thing that Saudi Aramco is doing, right? Is not to just be another oil and gas company. I think if this happens, it will happen with a very particular set of goals in mind. And it's 2022. A lot of these state-owned oil and gas companies have been around for a very long time. And I'm not particularly worried about the sort of dynamics that are at play in other places where, countries become really dependent on the revenue from these companies to fund their welfare states. I mean, that is often kind of what happens in petrostates, is that countries will become overly dependent on, so this is a sort of resource curse, right? That countries are very reliant on revenues from oil and gas and have a hard time getting off of it. We don't have that problem in the United States. We're not actually that dependent on fossil fuels for sort of national accounts. And so it's just a much different sort of political problem than, you get in a place like Venezuela, for instance, or Iraq, or, any number of places where huge sections of their public budgets are furnished with fossil fuel revenues.
I have a question. I think it might be more for Amy, actually. So, when I hear nationalization explained out this way, it sounds actually very practical, like a very, obvious solution. But it sounds so radical when people talk about it in the media. And I assume that's probably because of America's allergy to anything that kind of sounds socialist, even though we have plenty of things that actually are socialist. Amy, is this like the first time that nationalization has been talked about in the media in this way for the oil industry?
No. I mean, I think this conversation, honestly, I swear to God, I feel like we're living through the year, 1975 again right now. It's like all the, the gas prices and all. And the last time I think there was like a pretty robust conversation about nationalization of the oil companies was in the 70s. I feel like it came up again in the 2016 election a little bit. And now I definitely am seeing more media talking about it in the last few months than I've seen in quite a while. But I pretty consistently see conservative media kind of immediately being like, oh, do you want to be Venezuela? And so having this, kind of rational way of talking about it. And the point that you just made, Kate, about how, the U.S. is not set up in the same way that Venezuela is and would not be as dependent on oil revenue.
We're also not under punishing U.S. sanctions. Sorry.
That's right. That's right. Exactly. Exactly. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. But I'm curious, Kate, if you've seen other oil, like what this conversation looks like in other oil producing countries that don't have a nationalized oil industry. Like are these kinds of conversations coming up in Australia or Canada? I actually have seen them come up a little bit in Scotland, especially like with respect to if Scotland decides to have another independence referendum and then joins the EU, like what would happen to the industry there? And there, I think the conversation very much is nationalization with an eye towards transitioning off of fossil fuels. So anyway, I'm just curious, like what you've seen elsewhere around this stuff.
I pay most attention to the US, so I probably can't talk too much about Australia or Canada, but like you, the one place that I've seen that conversation raised is Scotland, which is this very interesting case and pretty close to Norway, right?
Yeah.
In the North Sea. And they already, capture a lot of the wealth from their oil producing regions for places like the Shetland Islands, for instance, which has a pretty large public wealth fund relative to its fairly small population.
They do. And they also have a weird number of brand new children's playgrounds because that's what they decided to spend a lot of that money on. Yes.
A friend of mine grew up there and described just all of these like rec centers that they have that are everywhere because and luxurious because they have this big wealth fund for like 20,000 people. Yeah, and that's the place that I've seen it most. I mean, interestingly, and this isn't fossil fuels, but is I think worth mentioning. So in Chile, Gabriel Boric, the newly elected left-leaning leader, he has talked on the campaign trail, and there's been a conversation within the sort of constitutional process taking place to rewrite their like super draconian, evil dictator era constitution to nationalize lithium production.
Oh, so interesting. I didn't know that. I knew they were talking about rights of nature in that process, but I didn't know they were nationalizing. That's so interesting.
I think that conversation is still ongoing, if I believe, but that was a campaign promise to nationalize this resource, which in the context of Chile, which, was the sort of ground zero for all of these crazy neoliberal experiments in the 1970s by University of Chicago economists and others, would be pretty remarkable, just given what a kind of free market paradise it's been painted as. And and that would, Bolivia has a certain amount of public ownership already built into its constitution. So that's the one case where I've seen this sort of conversation about a new nationalization of important resource talked about.
That is so interesting. I've been really way down the rabbit hole on the rights of nature stuff lately, and it's like this conversation is reminding me a little bit of that. Just in that I feel like what we're really talking about is like adjusting away from the private ownership approach to public resources. Like this idea that something that is a natural resource that is theoretically, owned by the public and or related to the public good, can be controlled by private companies or private people for profit, just kind of always leads to these sorts of problems. And you need a different decision-making framework to kind of, I don't know, rebalance the approach to those things. I don't know.
Yeah, and it's really helpful, I think, just as someone who spends most of my days paying attention to US politics, like just thinking beyond the US is really nice. And this, a framework that in the case of Bolivia, certainly, and in the case of the conversation happening in Chile is really influenced by a lot of indigenous thought about questions of ownership and land. And, just it's a very different relationship to these questions. And I think we have in the United States, at least from the sort of governmental perspective. And is really useful just for thinking through how do we govern these resources? Who gets a say over how this extraction happens, over who benefits from it, over the environmental impacts and biodiversity impacts of that. It's just a much, much more, I think, generative framework for thinking through how do we govern a 21st century economy.
Yeah. Speaking of biodiversity and rights of nature, who you might ostensibly wind up giving rights to bears in rights of nature. And do you know what you call a toothless bear?
That was such an incredible transition.
A toothless bear?
Yeah. I'll give you a hint. It's delicious.
Mayonnaise.
A gummy
I'm
bear.
just kidding.
Oh,
Gummy
my
bear.
God.
A gummy bear.
Oh, my God, Amy. You're going to give me a heart attack.
This part of my brain really not working so well today.
Bear. That's so good. I just can't. I can never think of good answers to these. Never. It's terrible.
Yeah. All right. You guys tried. That was a valiant effort.
I really try. All my thinking happens, it's
okay. I'll give you another one, Kate.
Okay.
I know that you're really into jumping rope. It's one of the very few things you've ever tweeted about your personal life on the Twitter machine. Have you heard the joke about jump rope?
The joke about jump rope. No, I haven't heard the joke.
You really can ask Amy for help with this.
Amy, can I have a hand?
Amy, have you heard the joke about jump rope?
I think I might know this one, so I'll pass.
Skip me. That's
yes,
that's it, Kate. You
skip it. Good job.
Okay. I got one for 4.
So this also makes me wonder how this might map to other energy sectors. Do we apply it to renewables too? In which case it helps with some of the mining issues around electrification. That goes to either one of you.
Yeah, well, you just talked about Chile. I know Bolivia has some of this. Have you seen it with other energy sectors too, including renewables?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because there are publicly owned renewables in the United States, right? I mean, there are places like Nebraska, which has an entirely publicly owned grid, and they are building out, publicly owned renewables. I think they contract out for a lot of that. But that is a very sort of low-hanging fruit model, right, is using the existing public utilities we have to build out public power. And, you know, something that appeared in Bernie Sanders' platform, for instance, in 2020 was to use the Tennessee Valley Authority to, you know, build up a massive amount of renewable power. So that's actually, you know, not so hard to imagine. I mean, it would require obviously getting rid of some of the more reactionary leadership of the Tennessee Valley Authority, some pretty serious institutional reforms, including, you know, rural electric cooperatives, which are governed in a lot of cases by really sort of old boys networks. But we have a lot of existing public institutions which could do this. And there's been a sort of exciting campaign here in New York, where I am, to build public renewables through the New York Power Authority, which is this New Deal sort of era institution, I believe created by FDR when he was governor of New York, which, you know, provides public power already and could be a vehicle for building out renewables as well. On the mining side, you know, I haven't seen much of a conversation in the United States about this yet, but it is sort of interesting to consider that this sector here especially is pretty new, right? We have one functional lithium mine in the United States. So in some ways, the terms of that debate of how, you know, a critical minerals industry is built up are a little bit more fungible than they might be in something like fossil fuels, where there's so much history. This is a newer sector, especially if you're talking about something like lithium or other critical energy minerals, which are used for EVs, electric vehicles, and energy storage and things like that. It's just a newer conversation. And like we said earlier, some of those conversations are already starting in Latin America. But yeah, in the United States, that's not here yet, but, you know, probably not to say that it will never happen.
Yeah, that's awesome, because I feel like, you know, in that one way, at least, maybe people are approaching that segment of the energy sector with like a different mindset than there has been in fossil fuels. So a little glimmer of hope there.
Yeah, and I mean, I just learned this week, but people like Jael Holtzman at E&E News and Thea Rio Francos, who I co-wrote A Planet to Win with, have been tracking this stuff, you know, for many years by this point. But the hard rock mining sector in the United States, which governs things like lithium, is governed by a law written for gold prospecting from 1872.
Amazing.
That is wild. I mean, it doesn't allow, there's no way for the government to collect royalties from mining. And just anyone can go out and stake a claim to deposits anywhere, basically, regardless of whether that's, you know, on treaty nation land, whether there, you know, are other competing claims to that land. It's a wild law and needs to be reformed one way or another. So, yeah, that will be an interesting conversation. And the need to reform that law, I think, is pretty evident, even to like fairly centrist types. So that is a conversation to watch, certainly.
Do you think it's evident to Joe Manchin?
Well, actually, it was another Democrat who intervened to stop a provision of the bipartisan infrastructure bill, or maybe the reconciliation bill, in the last couple of months.
Catherine Cortez Masto. That makes sense, because Nevada is like the place where lithium mining is happening, right? Great. That's great.
Yep. Made sure that royalties cannot be collected off of mining that happens in Nevada.
That's so crazy, because you would think that they would want that money in the state. Maybe they've gotten so rich off of the royalties they collect from cannabis that they don't need that lithium money. I don't know.
Well, it was pennies, too. I mean, it would have funded $1 billion worth of abandoned mine cleanup.
Oh, God. That's annoying. That's so annoying. Ugh. All right. Well, Mary, do you want to close us out here?
What do you call your grandma's number on speed dial?
Your grandma's number on speed
Granny Run.
Instagram.
Oh, that's good. That's good. That's good.
Awesome.
Wow.
Awesome.
All right, I got one. I'm still proud of myself for getting one. Yeah.
You did get one.
That was good.
You did get
That was
one.
good. I usually get none, so you should be happy.
I am.
Awesome. All right. Thanks, Kate, for having this conversation with us. It's great. Oh, actually, where can people follow you on Twitter, Kate?
People can follow me for better and for worse at my name at Kate Aronoff on Twitter.
Awesome.
And you should.
Informative and entertaining. Awesome. All right. Thanks, Kate.
Thanks so much. What a pleasure.
Hot Take is a Crooked Media production.
It's produced by Ray Pang and mixed and edited by Jules Bradley. Our music is by Vasilis Fotopoulos. Thamali Kodakara is our consulting producer. And our executive producers are Mary Anais Hegler, Michael Martinez, and me, Amy Westervelt.
Special thanks to Sandy Gerard, Ari Schwartz, Kyle Seglin, and Charlotte Landis for production support, and to Amelia Montooth for digital support.
You can follow the show on Twitter at Real Hot Take, sign up for our newsletter at hottakepod.com, and subscribe to Crooked Media's video channel at youtube.com/crookedmedia.